And welcome back to the second half hour of Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. I'm Mary Massey again, and I want to say that the views and opinions of today's program do not necessarily reflect those of the KMUD board, staff, and volunteers. Our next guest is Professor Stephen Ferguson. He is an American political scientist, an author who writes on politics, economics, often within a historical perspective. He is best known for his investment theory of party competition, described in detail in his book, Golden Rule, The Investment Theory of Party Competition, and the Logic of Money-Driven Political Systems. And if that's not apropos, I don't know what is. Professor Ferguson, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hi there.
Well, welcome to the program. It's so great to have you here for this first time. I wanted to start out just briefly to hear about the theory of party competition as it relates to finances, because we seem covered up in all kinds of billionaires and whatnot as our candidates are falling away and the Democrats. Can you speak to that?
Well, sure. I mean, look, it's easy. Let's begin with a caution that when you get into small numbers, all kinds of weird things happen, which means that if you're trying to understand money in politics in the U.S., best way is to probably look at where you've got hundreds of roughly comparable cases. And that's so where I and several of my colleagues, G. Chen, Paul Jorgensen, we looked at those in great detail. And what we found was pretty amazing once we'd done the work, which is not easy to do because you can't simply use anybody's simple published totals of spending. We could go into that, but let's just forget it. Anyway, if you do a good job on trying to figure out what people have actually spent, what we found was that the proportion of cash in races between Democrats and Republicans, that's to say, if you got two Democrats running against each other or something, as in a few states, you never mind, that won't work. But if you look at those races, which are the overwhelming percentage of races, what we found was that the split between votes and money was quite proportional. And it was a straight line, meaning the more cash you have as a higher percentage of all the cash spent between the two parties, the higher was your vote total. It's very regular. We call that a linear model. Right. That's a bit arch for normal conversation. It's just a statistical term. But it does mean that it's a very direct relationship. So then we got that. We put up these, you can graph that very easily. We did it in a string of papers. And people's reaction was incredulity, mostly. When we did it at, for example, conferences, you'd find the economists laughing, the political scientists angry, and the journalists mostly angry and saying that can't be true. Okay, finally people came back with, all right, we have to sort of admit this does seem to be true. But then it must be that how can you prove that the money isn't following the polls? Now that we thought about a long time. It's a very sticky question to analyze, and it has the usual way people do it, especially with statistics, are stupid. They just don't work very well. What we finally did was to do some very complex stuff that relies on essentially what we needed to have was an independent way of assessing how people thought people were going to win. And there's a lot of research, 20 years of it now, suggesting that if you're trying to get at what people expect, not what's going to happen. I'm not telling you this is a perfect predictor of that. But you could take betting odds, and so you could look at cases where you had as it were, the out-of-the-money prospects of candidates seemed just impossible, and then if you could find cases where they poured money in anyway and moved those, well, you'd have what you wanted. That's what we did. And the biggest case was one that's very important, the chances of the Republicans taking the 2016 Senate, holding on to it. I mean, you could actually buy contracts on that on the Iowa electronic markets for $7 or $8 that would pay $100 in less than 2 weeks. That's how far down they were. Then they poured in tons of money, and they saved the Senate for the Republicans. There are a few other cases like that, of which Newt Gingrich's famous takeover of the House in '94 is another. From which we conclude, we can say for sure now that money really does independently move elections. That doesn't mean there isn't joint interaction between polls and money. There obviously is some. But you can also clearly show that it has a powerful independent effect. So that's the general proposition. And more broadly, the case I've pressed for many years, this investment theory of party competition, is that, look, folks, before you get to anything about voters, you have got to understand that the costs of elections are real, and they're fairly high. They're a lot higher than most analysts have ever estimated. I mean, especially political theorists who sort of act like money grows on trees, like all good candidates somehow can get financing or something like that. You get past that point, and then you realize that what you've actually got to do in a political party is you've got to find a way to finance your appeals. That's the big change in American politics with Sanders. I mean, he basically took advantage of the electronic revolution, I think, the internet, to be able to raise large sums of small money. Mm-hmm. And he just concentrates on that. He doesn't raise large sums. We were a little skeptical ourselves, but we verified that in the case of 2016. You can't do it in a current race because the reporting is just rear view mirror. It's too low, but it's obvious. It's hard. You just pick up a paper and you realize that billionaires don't like Bernie Sanders. That's utterly plain.
Correct.
So basically, before you start doing anything else in political parties, they have got to find a way to raise the funds. Only then can they start picking up issues, which means if you can't finance the appeal, it cannot be made. And so there are all kinds of things that the public would like that it can't get. Nobody will actually talk about them. That was the sort of big point I pressed for many years, and I think it's very important. So, I'll stop there, and maybe we can talk about this.
Right. That reminds me, I thought it was Senator John McCain who was one of the folks, maybe it was even Bernie Sanders, that was interested in campaign finance reform, meaning you can't come in with a super PAC, and now we're here with, when you think of Mike Bloomberg just dropping over $500,000 with nobody's input, no voters, and so forth. Do you think we need a finance reform for our campaigns and our elections?
Absolutely. Look, there's just no reason why you should be allowed to just pour unlimited funds, and especially unlimited secret funds, into any race you like. I mean, it's basically the idea that corporations are people or something like that is so crazy one hardly knows what to say.
Right.
And it's like these are the same people. You talk about robots acting like people, and everybody gets uneasy. We've got giant robots running around. They're called corporations, if you like, and they just shouldn't be allowed to do it. Nor, bluntly, should billionaires. I mean, it's basically, I think, a very simple problem. There are real expenses to campaigning.
Right.
Now, you got to either find a way to share those in small amounts, or a few people are going to put up most of the money, and they're going to control the system. There aren't any intermediate positions here. Right now, the U.S. is suffering from a grotesque imbalance. Now, we might want to pick up the Bloomberg case for a minute.
All right.
Because it's actually quite interesting. I think the Washington Post, of course, could not restrain itself yesterday from claiming, that proves money doesn't really dominate the political system, because, after all, Bloomberg just pulled out. Look again. What that guy did was, first of all, He spent enormous sums, and then in state after state, he got anywhere from 10 to 20% of the vote.
Right.
When he jumped in with no support. It's actually pretty amazing. When you see guys getting, large percentages of the vote in a place like Arkansas, where they have no tie, or Missouri, or any of these middle border states, where Bloomberg, he didn't win, but he did quite well, coming from nothing in the space of a couple of, few months, basically.
Right.
It was amazing to watch. And the other side of it is, it's not like he's disappeared yet. He pulled out the Post had it backwards. Bloomberg's campaign was working. It was dividing the Democratic Party. That's why he pulled out there. In effect, you've got a consolidation of all the big money interests around Biden. And that is the big fact here. And finally, Bloomberg decided to join him. I would add that I think there is perhaps still a slight chance if Biden stumbles, you might see Bloomberg having, as it were, taken one for the team, suddenly reappear. I'm not sold on the idea that Biden can actually show up in public, talk sensibly, and not look bad for, say, 2 months. You must be do it in the past, and I don't think it's going to start soon.
You must be talking about him confusing his wife with his sister. But to that point, what if Biden has a Pete Buttigieg or even a Bloomberg for a VP? Wouldn't that make a big difference?
No.
Really?
Well, first of all, if you ask me, it's perfectly obvious that in the Democratic Party they're going to, the normal, what I'll call the conventional expectation, I think for good reason, is that he's going to have a woman vice president.
Oh, so Klobuchar perhaps.
Well, if I had a bet, I'd say I think there is some pressure for Kamala Harris.
Ah, yeah, that's true.
But we'll just have to see. That's sort of rank speculation. But no, Biden, it depends how reassured one is by the thought that, well, if your president is not quite all there, you don't worry, the vice president is.
Right.
You can tell me where you come out on that one. I don't think a lot of people will be that. I think this is sort of made to order for Donald Trump.
Right. And speaking of Trump, just from your perspective and your studies, what do you think is going to happen with his hit? And I don't believe there's anyone currently going to run against him. I think Bill Weld dropped out, or maybe he hasn't. I don't know. What do you think?
It doesn't matter. Nothing is going to happen in the Republican Party.
You don't think so?
Nope.
All right.
Know it by now. This is not the sort of thing you can pull at the last minute. I'm sure the filing deadlines for many states in a primary have already closed. Yeah.
So I wanted to, in January, and we may have covered some of this, you had an article that you co-wrote with Paul Jorgensen and G. Jen. Yeah, the 2020 election in 3 graphs.
Yep.
Talk about that. Where does that come from? Explain to our listeners what that means.
Okay, well, what we did was pretty straightforward. The first graph is the pictures are often worth 1,000 words. So what we did was we plotted how much money people got from donors of various sizes, meaning what was your total contribution from an individual or a company or whatever. And what you could see in our graph was that one person stood out for having an enormous chunk of his money. My memory on this is like over about 60% from actually so small you didn't have to report. And then virtually all the rest of the money was in the lower categories. He had, in effect, no big money. That was Sanders in 2016. When you plot both the Democratic and the Republican leadership and add in Hillary Clinton, who was the leader at that point, she was the nominee, what you find is they all look alike. They're being carried by big money. Now, admittedly, there are small differences between them. Like Mitch McConnell is simply off the charts for big money. It's like crazy. It's like a rocket at the right end of the thing. But never mind that. The point is they all look pretty much the same. They're dependent on big money. That includes Schumer and Pelosi. That was the first graph, which means that you're looking at, in effect, two Democratic parties. And then you could, from a certain perspective, outside of Sanders, and I would have added Warren for a while, there was, in effect, one big money set of people, and they were split, but they're still all big money. All right, now, then the next question was what happened in 2016 and then 2018. And what you find is that there was this huge turnout surge, so that the Democratic share of all possible voters went way up in 2018 by comparison with congressional elections of the previous 4 years. In other words, we know that turnout is very high in presidential election years. 2018 just fell off hardly at all. I mean, which normally falls off by about like a quarter or a third. And then the last one was actually the graph on the Senate and the Republican money in 2016, which was just a way of showing how big money can change elections. The conclusion was that Trump was going to raise the largest sums ever, and he's clearly going to do that. And we were going to maybe see, if you saw Sanders versus Trump, which was not something we said was going to happen, but if it did happen, you'd have, here got a small money candidate versus a big money candidate. Now you're going to have maybe Biden. I still think he can stumble. And I think it's been a weird year, and it's likely to get weirder.
Right.
But Biden will be lavishly financed, not only by Bloomberg, but a lot of other billionaires. And so this is a horse of a somewhat different color, but it's going to be a very interesting race. But Trump is going to raise money on a gigantic, probably unprecedented scale.
Wow. I have a question. We had a listener to write in a question at heroesandpatriots at gmail.com, and the question is, given that we were discussing changes in financing, campaign financing, does this mean that McCain/Feingold had no effect on the money in politics? Question.
Yeah, I don't think it really did, except to change its form. There were a variety of ways you could get around that. People poured money into so-called 527s and similar vehicles. That's why I don't actually think that the decision, Citizens United, was all that path-breaking. The main thing I think Citizens United did, which occurred some years later, was to sort of habituate corporate treasurers to writing checks very easily. It did make it easier to do that. And I think that it's probably had a big effect on local political finance. But I'm not, in federal elections, we've had huge loopholes since at least the mid-1980s. The category so-called soft money, and then there was not party-related stuff. You could do all kinds of things, and while it pretended sometimes not to be related to the particular races, it was. It comes in these 2 and 4 year cycles that are very obvious. So I'm not. McCain-Feingold was clearly a failure. Ironically, I actually ran into Feingold at a conference after the 2016 election, where I actually presented that the comments I just made about how late money pouring in reversed the trend in Senate races, and he told me he'd been ahead until the final weeks when he watched all this cash drop in on the other side, and he went down.
Mr. Ferguson, or Dr. Ferguson, we have a follow-up question to that idea about Feingold and McCain. Go ahead, caller.
Thank you. So I Really appreciate this important conversation because it's such a crucial issue. And just given the answers about McCain-Feingold, is there what I would be interested in the policy implications from your important analyses? Is it a public funding of elections, especially federal elections? And what would really work to reduce the huge money on both sides of the aisle?
Okay, couple of things. I would certainly ban large. Now, you understand there'll be a constitutional argument about this, and people will be yelling you need a constitutional amendment. I actually think the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, could do a lot with its enforcement, though it could not do all the things that I'm just about to say. I mean, right now, they don't do any serious enforcement, and they let all this dark money go by, which they probably could tap down with just a different ruling. There are people arguing both sides of this, but I think they could do a great deal more on enforcement. We won't. I'll just set that to one side. I would just basically ban large contributions across the board. I like public funds where everybody gets, if you like, they can either do a small contribution or they can, I wouldn't mind doing it by a tax credit for the funds, but it's just a small amount of money. And then people, you can effectively compete for those if you like. But I wouldn't let people pour cash in, and I would require very strict limits on funds that aren't apparently about politics but really are. Where, for example, this is sometimes difficult to settle. It wouldn't be the easiest law to draft, but basically you'll see cases like this. We know this happens with congressmen and women. Corporations will give, or their foundations will give grants to their spouses. And then nothing appears to go into the campaign at all. That kind of stuff should be illegal.
Wow.
At least it should be disclosed, which,
right,
as far as I can tell, mostly it's not. I mean, it's taken a long time for anybody to do any work on this. But what they find is pretty straightforward. The one also finds that, I mean, there is a wonderful paper at by a guy named Ahmed Tahoun and several other people at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, where I'm the research director, though I'm not talking for the Institute today. It's just my own views here.
Right.
But what Tahoun showed you in the vote on the bailout back in 2008, there lots of people. It turned out if they or their spouses were heavily in the market, it mattered. But they also found out that if you went on the finance committee, the banking oversight committees,
right,
the amount you borrowed from banks went way up as soon as you got your appointment on that committee, and they were able to rule out things like you were already borrowing a lot and things like that. It's clear that there's a lot of indirect political money. Indeed, my colleagues and I have a paper that'll be out shortly, rephrasing another one we did some years back, where there's a whole spectrum of political money that isn't looking like it's political. The most important for public policy is often the fees that are paid to people before they go into federal office. I mean, there are actually cases. One of Obama's Treasury nominees had that case, not Geithner, but the guy that succeeded him,
right,
where he had a clause in a contract that if he went for public service, why the bank would give him a bonus. That's ridiculous. And there were most everybody sitting in the White House in Obama's thing, they all had fairly large honoraria grants or whatever, or they had jobs that paid them a lot of cash, often for stuff. I mean, there was one guy who was getting paid to advise an investment bank on philanthropy, almost $1 million a year. I will tell you that nobody makes $1 million a year advising on philanthropy in a real market. I mean, these should be treated as bribes.
Right. Well, if it's up to the Federal Election Committee, how is it going to what's going to collapse this phenomenon? I mean, there's criticism that once this candidate is elected from millions of dollars that they owe people, the donors.
That's right. Well, that's not just criticism. I think it's plainly true.
Yeah.
Look, we have a paper. We did this. Maybe I could just talk about it for 2 minutes. I was tired of everybody telling me that there was no way you could show that congressmen and women didn't sell votes. The claim was, there's always some, on any individual case, there's always something else you can invoke. And actually, I agree with that. That's why you do a statistical approach. But so then what we did was we looked only at the congressional representatives in the House who had voted in favor of Dodd-Frank, the bill that was supposed to regulate finance more tightly, passed, in 2009 after, the wake of 2000, maybe it actually passed 2010 early on, after the 2008 financial collapse. Then what we did was to look at all the folks who voted for this bill and track how they backslid under pressure over the next 3 or 4 elections. Now, the interesting thing, the twist in that is we had the same people in basically the same districts. Small changes on some reapportionment, but nothing big. And so you could look very directly at the time-varying factors there. And the time-varying things turned out to be 2. One of them was how much money they got from financial interests.
Right.
And then the other one was in the year they left Congress, they sold out on a much higher propensity to do that. In other words, they just cashed out, voted with the banks, and then, I'm sure if we'd had the ability to go look, we'd have probably found an interesting pattern in post-legislative employment.
Well,
but those 2 things were very clear results. People looked at that paper and they just said to me, I had one famous statistician tell me, well, maybe these people are really just like to do middle-of-the-road stuff. And I had to point out to him that we actually had a control for that.
Thomas Ferguson, I'm afraid
these guys sell their votes. They just do, at least in a fair number of cases.
Right.
It's grotesque. It's open. People need to start from that presupposition and get on with reform.
Thomas Ferguson, thank you so much for being our guest today, and we'll watch things as they progress towards November. You've been a terrific guest, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.